Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Larson Hicks. I'm joined by Pastor Rich Lusk, and this is our first episode of a new podcast. And we're excited about this. This is something we've been kind of hatching and scheming about for a minute, and it's finally here. So the podcast name I think that we have settled on is Got a Minute, and kind of the origin story of that is I've called Rich, or texted Rich probably more frequently, a text that says something like, "Hey Rich, do you got a minute?" And Rich is always gracious, even though his time it has a lot of demands on it, and he'll pick up and go, "Hey, what's up?" And about an hour and a half later, we're still going on. We've covered like 20. Covering like 25 different topics. So I think at some point, Rich and I realized, hey, we like talking, and we usually get into solving all of the world's problems on all of our phone calls. So this is probably something worth sharing. So I think that's the basic origin story. So let's do intros real quick. For those who don't know, one of us, you're probably seeing this on one of our Facebook feeds or something, but I am Larson Hicks. I'm a business guy, a dad with a bunch of kids, a churchman involved in a church plant in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm an elder there and helped plant the church. And that's probably enough about me. Just kind of who I am and what I'm up to. Rich is a pastor of Trinity Presbyterian Church down in Birmingham, Alabama, just down the road. And Rich is the author of a number of books, Paedo Faith, and others, and is a well recognized teacher and theologian and scholar on a wide variety of topics. You can find Rich. What's the do you know the URL for your Pastor's Corner on your website offhand?
Well, yeah, if you go to our church website, which is trinity-pres.net, then you can find all kinds of things there. If you go to the Pastor's Corner, that's where you can find a lot of my writings and some more like conference audio, that
Awesome.
kind of thing.
So check that out. Trinity
or
Presbyterian
speaking
Church in
engagements.
Birmingham, Pastor's Corner. That's where you can find a lot of Rich's stuff. So yeah, we'll jump into it. I did think we settled on Got a Minute, but there were some fun suggestions. I think it was Gia French, who actually goes to my church, who recommended that name. But we had some pretty fun submissions. I don't know if you saw these, Rich. So Fado Paith
I think
was one.
saw a few of them. I don't know if I saw all of them.
What that was, what the I mean, obviously your book. What else we got here? Baptizing Bama, being that we're both in Bama. I could see that. Lusk and You Will Receive. I liked that. I thought that had maybe some potential. Brian Sauve asked, "What's the main thrust?" And then Aaron Ely said, "Main thrust." That sounds like a great podcast name. I'm with Aaron. I think that, although that I don't know, that's kind of weird. Men with Chests, I thought was a good submission. A little nod. Yeah, exactly. I've been wondering when we're going to start naming things St. Louis, Academy and St. Louis's church. I'm already there, but it seems like I'm premature. People haven't gotten to naming things after Lewis yet enough, in my humble opinion. David Ho said the Toctagon, which I thought was pretty sweet. I could see that. And then of course Michael Foster got a lot of attention with his The Rich Hicks podcast, Theology for Normal People. I like it. I'm not so sure about the Rich Hicks part. It's clever.
The
Yes, that
theology for
definitely
normal part,
fits.
that for normal people part, that probably fits.
Yes. Well,
That's
when
hopefully what
Rich
we're
suggested
doing.
this idea, I kind of, my view was like, I'm a normal guy and you're a theologian, so this is perfect. You can kind of explain things to me, and that'll probably be helpful to a lot of people. Well, that's enough of the suggestions. There were some bad ones. Joffrey Swait gave a terrible one. Lusky Hicks. No, that was Jason Farley. Lusky Hicks or Hickey and Lusky. Just terrible. Your friend Bill Smith had Rich and Bubba. I think that's a nod to the yes, which makes me
Yeah,
Bubba,
yeah,
I
take
guess.
off on Rick
So
and Bubba.
I don't know what to say about that. Eric Kahn suggested black and tan. And said, "Remember, all publicity is good publicity." I like that. That's a little edgy. All right, I'll stop. They are fun. Thank you for all the submissions, everybody. We appreciate it. But I think Gia wins the prize. Got a minute, I think, is what we're going to stick with. So let's frame up our first conversation here. Our goal is to kind of keep this relatively short and just kind of get into whatever topics. We've already come up with a huge list of topics we want to discuss. This first one is on a video that's a couple weeks old. This isn't really a hot take or anything. It's just Jordan Peterson's message to Christian churches that made the rounds a couple weeks ago. And so I posted it on my Facebook page and said I thought Peterson was dead on. This was a couple weeks ago. So we just thought we'd talk about it. And we don't want to make the video about Jordan Peterson per se. I think most people know what he's all about. But I think he hits the nail on the head here on some really important things that I do think the church needs to open their eyes to. So Rich, what caught your attention here on this video of Dr. Peterson's?
Yeah, well, the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon, of course, has gotten a lot of attention, and I think it's important to understand why that is the case. How did he get such a sizable audience, and particularly such a huge audience of men, when, by contrast, the church, and particularly the evangelical church, which would include Reformed churches in the West, has really struggled to hold men's attention, to keep men involved.
Yep.
So I think that in and of itself makes it worth considering. And if you think back on how Jordan Peterson really became famous, it was really because he took a rather courageous stand against some transgender insanity and basically said, I reserve the right to speak truth, to pursue truth and to speak truth. And so I do think we can say, well, I do not think Jordan Peterson is a Christian. I think he is Christian adjacent. He's perhaps not that far from the kingdom. And I think he has a lot of insights. The fundamental antithesis is always going to be between Christian and non-Christian. So if you just, you draw a line, you have Christian on one side, non-Christian on the other. But then among those who are on the non-Christian side of the antithesis, you can draw another line, a sort of dotted line, and say that there's kind of another sort of secondary antithesis between those who believe in some kind of objective reality and those who don't. And so Peterson falls into that. He's not on the Christian side of the antithesis. He's on the non-Christian side, but he's on the side of the non-Christian antithesis of people who do believe in some kind of objective reality. And that actually makes him stand out in today's world, where you have many people who don't seem to believe in any objective reality. Feelings are dominant. Feelings define reality. People can't define what a woman is, that kind of thing. We've seen that. But because Peterson does at least believe in objective reality to some extent, he's able to say many things that do correspond to reality. And many of the things that he has said to men and about men resonate as being true. And in many cases, he's willing to say things that pastors who you would expect to be carrying the torch for truth and to speak truth on on everything in God's world, have not been willing to do. And so Peterson stands out for that reason as a rather courageous example of somebody who is
Hmm.
not a Christian but is willing to speak truth in certain crucial areas. Now, I think his message to the
Yeah.
churches, especially it seems on behalf of young men, it's like what maybe a 10-minute video. It's really really interesting, and
Sure.
there's certainly things about it that you could critique, and maybe we'll get into some of those things.
Sure.
He does not give the gospel, obviously, because he's not a Christian, but much of what he says does tie into biblical themes and biblical themes that go back to the creation account and the creation mandate,
Yeah.
biblical themes that tie into what is the calling of men. But again, I think one thing, and Larson, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Hmm.
Why is it that the church has struggled? And let's just really focus on what we know best, which would be the evangelical and reformed branch of the church.
Hmm.
Why is it that the church has struggled with men? From the most recent statistics I have
Hmm.
seen, put it at about a 60-40 split, that the evangelical church tends to be about 60% female, so you've got 40% male.
Hmm.
What explains that? What led to that? What needs to
Yeah.
be done about that? I think that's the
Yeah,
kind of thing
I
that Peterson
agree. I
is
agree with everything you
probably
said.
getting at.
I tend to have a view that and this isn't the point of the video, but I'm more of the view that I think Peterson's on the path to Christianity. I wonder if he's a Christian, just not an evangelical. He knows the Bible. He's I've seen videos. His daughter seems to be a Christian. Again, they don't look or smell anything like the Christians you and I grew up with or surrounded by. They're still culturally in a very different place. But I heard Michaela Peterson talking about how she reads the Bible every day and she prays every day now, and how impactful it's been. So it's really hard to kind of figure out where they're at, and they obviously say and do a lot of things that you're like, this is nothing. Our tribe would never do anything or say anything like this. But they do seem to be. It's kind of like we already mentioned Lewis in this episode. And I was reading last night with one of my sons. We were reading Orthodoxy, and it's both Lewis and Chesterton had a similar. They were atheists who rejected God and found their way back to historic Christianity. And it feels like Peterson's maybe on a similar trajectory, a guy who's interested in truth, and who's actually willing to do the work, to really dive deep into the data and into the ideologies and the philosophies, and he's arriving from a very different angle. He's arriving at ancient truth, biblical truth in a lot of cases. To answer your question, or just to kind of riff on your question, Rich, about why the church has missed the mark with young men in particular, just men in general, I think men want to be competent. Men want to have who want to take dominion, and they want to they want to be surrounded by men who will be iron sharpening iron, who will make them stronger, make them better. And so I think when men walk into a church and are greeted by men that don't don't carry themselves with any sort of confidence, that don't seem to have any sort of competence. They went to a lot of pastors these days grew up with all the choir ladies. They were sort of the darlings of the choir ladies, and so they're great around women. They're great around little old ladies. Those that demographic they've got nailed down, and by the way, that demographic tends to run the churches. And so I think a masculine man walks into a church and goes, there's nothing here for me. There's certainly not a tribe of men who are going to make me more competent, more excellent, who are going to challenge me. There's nobody here that I'm scared of, like physically. There's nobody here. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think, we had I went to lunch with a couple visitors to our church. We had two physicians drive an hour and a half to visit our church on Sunday. One had come the week before, and he brought a friend back. And these are both fit, buff dudes who are physicians, right, with big families. And we went to lunch with them just to talk. And I said, "Why did you guys come back?" And one of the wives said, That's the first church I've been to where I looked around and it was the men who were participating. The men were singing. The men were saying amen. The men were engaged. And she just said, "I've never seen that before in a church," which is a real tragedy. But I think that's where we're at, and so I don't think young men are okay. Let me say it one more way, Rich, and I'll stop. But I think it's the attractional thing. Men don't want to be attracted, right? They don't want to be lured in with sweet things or nice things or pleasant things. The most attractive thing to men typically is a challenge. Is a dare. Is a we right. It's a mission. Like we've been doing at our church a young men's discipleship thing, and this summer, and it's been led by a bunch of men in our church, and they do, and it's awesome. I got to hear my son talk about it on Sunday to these visitors. He said, "We go to this thing and they kick our butts." We did a combat fitness test. We had to lift ammo cans and we had to sprint for half a mile, and we had to do this like combat movement thing. It was awesome. As a young man, like that's the highlight of his week is somebody challenging him to do something really hard. Churches aren't doing that. From the pulpit, they're not saying there's no challenge or mission that's laid out. It's a lot of comfort and feel good kind of stuff. So I think all that stuff is actually meant to be attractional, but it's repulsive, I think, to most masculine men.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I think you're exactly right. It is interesting. Several things you mentioned there, I think, are exactly right. The idea that men like to be challenged. One thing that Peterson said in his video is that when it comes to attracting young
Right.
men, Protestants are the
Right.
worst. Now, he might be talking about mainline Protestants. That would make a lot of sense. But perhaps even evangelical Protestants,
Yeah.
I think there's been a drift towards antinomianism in evangelicalism over the last generation. I listen to a lot of preaching, just try to take in a wide variety of sermons, preachers from all over the country, different evangelical denominations. And that is one thing I've noticed is how little the preaching will focus
Mm-hmm.
on a call to
Right.
repentance, a call to obedience, our responsibility. There's a way of preaching grace that does
Right.
become antinomian. And I
Well,
think
there's a ditch
sometimes
on the
that
other
is
side
happening in
too,
our
Rich,
churches. And I think that can be something
where I think a lot of
that
sermons maybe is a reaction against that, and I think this is more applicable to our circles. Is like a super theological sermon. We visited a PCA church who was like on week 9 of a 12-week series on what, what was it on it was like on one of the points of the Ordo Salutis. It's like we're gonna right. I know. I
obviously
just
very
laughed to
memorable.
myself. It's like you're seriously on like week 9 of this one point of the Ordo Salutis. Brutal. And so I think there's another the sermon that convicts of sin, but also is trying to lead men towards excellence, towards virtue in their lives, where you're actually saying, men, stop doing this thing, do it like this. This is how Christ taught us to do these types of things. Do it this way. It's like a father or grandfather coming alongside their son or grandson, teaching them how to change the oil. Like that's a dynamic that doesn't exist, I think, in enough churches anymore. And so men tune out. There's nothing for me to gain here. It
Yeah.
feels.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's been demonstrated that Christian publishing
Yeah.
is primarily targeted towards an audience of women.
Yeah.
I think that's true of a lot of pastors in their preaching in ministries of the church, very much targeted towards women. I think a lot of times, people point to different things. Like David Morrow points to, for example, one way to get men involved in church is, say, through
Yeah.
technology or something like that. That kind of
Yeah.
answer doesn't really impress me. I don't think that really does a whole lot. But I do think that a lot of times men walk into a church and because I've
Yeah.
noticed this too, and I think it's, you're describing it with a
Yeah.
sermon, but I've noticed it just more generally, just the whole ethos is um, the whole ethos or feel of the
Yeah.
everything. It may be architecture or the way the service itself unfolds. Very little there that would appeal to men. A lot of times this is true of the music, especially with I think a lot of the more contemporary
Hmm.
Christian music is very
Hmm.
much more attuned
Yeah.
to feminine sensibilities than masculine sensibilities. I think sometimes there's a real
Yeah.
alienation from creation and from physicality. You talked
Yeah.
about men being oriented towards dominion
Yeah.
and towards a mission. Man was made from the earth in the beginning. Man was made to take dominion over the earth, to subdue the earth. And if the Christian faith is divorced from that kind of earthiness, from creation, if we think of
Hmm.
spirituality in more Gnostic terms, where the
Yeah.
spiritual man is the man who has very little to do with created reality,
Yeah.
which I think is a distortion of what spirituality is, then that's going to be alienating. To be truly spiritual, in a biblical sense, to be filled
Yeah.
with the Spirit, means that you're going to be
Totally.
engaged in ruling over the creation
Totally.
in wisdom. It's not going to take you out of this creation. It's going to make you a more effective
Right.
um, ruler within the creation. So I think a lot of times there is this. A lot of times the church's
Yeah.
message is kind of alienated from creation itself. I think there's also just a bias within the culture. I think everybody who's paid attention to
Yeah.
our culture would say our culture has moved in a very effeminate direction, and I think that shows up in various ways in the church's teaching. I think that it is very easy uh, if you are teaching in a church context today to talk about
Right.
things that
Right.
women do well or things that women do better than men,
Sure.
and to talk about those kinds of feminine virtues, the kinds of things that women excel at. But
Oh
if you were to
yeah.
turn around and say, now here's something that
Oh
men
yeah.
do better
Big
than
time.
women, you might find yourself in a lot of trouble. Because that you're just,
Totally.
it's almost like a double standard has emerged where if you talk
Yeah.
about something women do well, that's great. Men don't generally have a problem with that. But if you turn around and talk about something that men might
Yeah.
do better, you're going to be accused
Well,
of
it's like
misogyny
Michael
or
Foster's
who
book.
knows
I
what.
mean, the
Uh,
title, it's wonderful how controversial the title of his book is. It's good to be a man. Like that statement is such a bold statement in today's world, which is pretty wild, in today's church that saying it's good to be a man would be offensive and controversial.
You also talked about, one thing that this woman that visited your
Yeah.
church recently noticed is how the men participated, and I think
Mhm.
that is a huge issue. And so, how do you get
Yeah.
men to participate in the liturgy?
Yeah.
And I can, we've talked about how this is a big problem in evangelical churches. I think in a lot of Reformed churches
Yeah.
that there's this
Yeah.
disconnect with men. I think it's very
Sure.
much true in black churches, black conservative churches. Even though probably the largest church I've ever preached at was a black church here in Birmingham. I got to know the pastor. He invited me to come speak at one of their services. Huge theater style building, and I mean it's a great church. He's a great pastor. But I did notice the audience
Yeah.
or congregation was
Yeah.
heavily skewed towards women, much more than 60-40. And it was interesting because while I mean, obviously the church had a male pastor, everybody else who was up front, like say for the music, was all women.
Yeah.
So when we were singing, it was all women up front. And it was interesting because I would say most of what we sang, uh,
Yeah.
most
Totally.
men probably would not have
Yeah.
wanted to be up front, leading, singing these songs. The one time another man, the one time in the service that a man came up
Hmm.
front to lead something was when we sang the doxology. It was the one piece of traditional service music, one piece of traditional worship music that was
I bet
in the
more men
service,
sang
and
it.
a man came up front to lead it. And I thought it was just really, really interesting. Hear the
Yep.
music. It seems
Yep.
all to appeal to women. It's led by women. There's a message being sent
Yep.
there that there are no men up front for the singing part of the service. And then the one part of the
Yep.
service where a man does come up front, besides the preaching, is when we sing this one. It's the only piece of traditional music in the service. I think that that's something
Yeah.
also that we
Yeah.
need to think about. What do we sing? Do we encourage our men to sing? Do we see
Yeah.
do we see singing as a manly
Yeah.
activity, something men traditionally have done
Yeah.
together? Think about the sea shanties
Sure.
or work songs that men would sing, or of course even the singing of psalms, chanting of psalms. The fact that a lot of the more traditional church music has a more robust, masculine, triumphalistic,
Yeah.
even martial, warlike sound to it, and I
Yeah,
think
I
a lot of
mean,
that has been
I
lost in
think you hit the
today's
nail on the
church.
head. I mean, you asked the question a minute ago: how do we get more men participating in church? And I think the first thing is, yeah, there should be men leading for one. Men are gonna are designed to lead, and men want to follow a strong man. Godly men, and this is a topic for a whole other conversation, but godly men love submission in the context of hierarchy. We love the idea of having a king and being a knight, and being faithful to our king. Like that's a concept that's baked in, to our souls. We love that. But the idea of following a woman doesn't feel right. Something about that doesn't feel right, and I don't think it should. And so I think
Well, because
that's right.
we're really
Yeah,
talking about who will we follow into battle, because that the church is many things, and this is not the only way to look at the church,
totally.
but the church is God's army, and
Hmm.
the worship gathering is our holy warfare. So one question I would ask about, let's say, any man who wants to be
Yeah,
a leader in the church, a pastor or an elder, obviously you have lots of character qualifications laid out in places like 1 Timothy 3. He's got to be able to rule his house well. He's got to have godly character, certainly. But I think another question, which certainly I think flows out of the scripture to ask, is, will
yeah,
other
that's good.
men
That's
follow
good.
this man into battle, spiritual battle? And it's really interesting to me. If you go back to the Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament, how did the Levites become the priestly tribe?
Mm-hmm.
It's because when there was idolatry in the
Good.
camp,
I love
they
it.
went out and they slaughtered the
Yes.
idolaters. Okay, that was priestly work. Okay, so if you want to be a
Yeah.
priest, if you want to be a pastor, if you want to be a leader in the church,
Yeah.
obviously we don't do that with physical swords today, but the kind of courage and zeal,
Yep.
the commitment to holiness and to waging warfare against sin and against idolatry that you see with the
Yep.
Levites, that's got to characterize the leadership of the church. Phineas, his line, he's in the high priestly line. How is that confirmed or established?
Yep.
Well, again, when there is idolatry and adultery in the camp,
Yeah.
Phineas takes up his sword and goes to
Yes.
battle. It's a very masculine task. It is warfare. And if you're not willing to uh, engage in that kind of spiritual warfare, lead in that kind of spiritual warfare, if you're not willing to
Yep.
uh, apply the spiritual death penalty, as it were, to
Yep.
idolaters and adulterers, then you can't be in church leadership. I would say there's
Yep.
something about the task itself that is
Totally.
fundamentally masculine. And Alistair Roberts has made the point, and I think it's helpful, that uh, and actually Jordan Peterson makes this point in many places too. Jordan Peterson says that men typically rank much
Mm-hmm.
higher in terms of disagreeability,
Yeah.
whereas and women rank much higher in agreeability. And it's not that one is better than the other, it's that those different
That's
personality
right.
traits are suited for different kinds of tasks. Well, leadership in the church requires you to a certain degree
Totally.
to be okay with being disagreeable, to be okay with confrontation. And if you're trying to always avoid confrontation with sin, confrontation with the world, you're going to end up compromising. And so Alistair Roberts makes the point that, say, for example, when you get women into church
Mm.
leadership, it's very, very hard to correct a woman because
Totally.
men always end up looking like bullies when they do so. But also that agreeableness factor in
Yes.
as a female trait, which is wonderful in those places where women are typically called to serve and minister, but in some kind of leadership position in the
Yep.
church can become deadly. We could talk, obviously at great length, why the
Yep.
leadership of the church must be masculine. Why we see that in Old Testament and New Testament. It's commanded. It's given to us by example. There are symbolic reasons for that. There are spiritual reasons for that. There are reasons for that related
Mm-hmm.
to masculinity and femininity,
Yeah.
what men are called
Well,
to
it's
be
one of
and
the
do, and what women are called to be and
yeah, and
do.
I think it's one of the
The
failures.
different
I mean,
traits of God as well.
I tend to be. I know this is an unpopular view, maybe in our circles, but I don't like the idea of sending of men going off to seminary as a career choice. I know that happens, and I don't think everyone who's done that is wrong or whatever. But I think the idea of a man being, on mission, accomplishing work, providing for a family, ministering in his own sphere of influence, that man being called by his church, being picked out and identified as a man who is leading, a man who has respect in the community, who men want to follow. That man being called by the church and told, "Hey, we need you. We need you to put down your day job and go serve." There's something to that. I don't know that necessarily is every pastor, but I think you've got to have those kinds of men in your church. And so, like, one of the things, I meant to say this earlier, but the something we've done in Huntsville for long before we planted this church, started doing a beer and hymns event where we literally said, "Hey, the only agenda here is for men to get together and to sing loudly in public, and we're not a choir. There's no training. This is just be a man, go be a Christian in public somewhere." And the beer helps. And it's right. And it's also fellowship, right? Like, and so we did that we've been doing that for
Yeah.
8 years, 7, 8 years. We've had hundreds of men come to beer and hymns from PCA, Methodist, Baptist, Church of Christ. I mean, the whole gambit. We've had men from all over, and always their first time, they're like, I've never experienced anything like this as a Christian man. I've never done anything like this before. I've never been in a group of men who don't,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
That's
it
good.
wouldn't work. I'll just say, I'm sure some people have tried doing this and it's worked at various levels, but I don't think it works if you don't have a man who can lead, who can confidently stand up and go, "Let's go, men. We're going to sing.
Yeah.
We're going to sing in this public place a bunch of hymns, and
Right.
it's going to look silly, and we're going to do it loudly."
Yeah, I think that's great. I want to go back to your comment about seminary. I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I think whether or not a man goes to
Sure.
seminary, you can debate the pros and cons of that. And certainly there are certain, there are things that men need to know
Yeah.
that sometimes seminary is the
Sure.
best place to get it, like languages, for example. But I think the problem is maybe not even just, sending a man off
Mhm.
to seminary. It's what seminaries have become. What if seminaries were more
Yeah.
like boot camp or basic training, where they were
Yeah.
much more rigorous and masculine in their
Yeah.
in the way that
Yeah.
they went about training pastors. I think part of it is the whole
Right.
concept of what a seminary is has been so diluted, and it's become, in many cases,
Yeah.
a very effeminate um,
Right.
culture on the seminary campus. I mean, even in seminaries that are committed to complementarianism and would say only men can be pastors, uh, the kinds of just this kind of
Right.
environment, the kind of culture that's there is
Right.
not going to create the kind of men who are going to be able to lead
Right.
churches in times of crisis
Right.
or
Well, and
into the kind of spiritual warfare that we've
if being a
discussed.
pastor is the job that you've chosen, is the career path you've chosen, you've put yourself, I think, if you're a young man who has no other skills, no other, competency, no other really ability to provide for his family, you put yourself in a precarious situation as a young man, who's got maybe student loan debt. You've gotta be, you got to play the game. You've got to play the political game in whatever part of the church you're in to make sure you don't lose your livelihood. And that doesn't put you in a place to be a Levite who goes and runs a spear through the adulterous couple in your church. They may be the big donors or the big tithers in the church. So there's already this kind of defensive posture, that I think a lot of these men have of, I'm looking around to see who's moving in what direction, so I can make sure not to say or do anything that's going to jeopardize my ability to be a pastor in this denomination. and that's the last thing we need, in the church. And that's not a man that other men want to
Yeah.
follow. That's a bureaucrat ultimately. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really good. Going back to the Peterson video, a couple other things I noticed. One, he talks about how boys in our culture
Yep.
are shamed.
Yep.
Boyhood is seen as a problem to be solved. So the fact that boys, for example, they're
Yeah.
shamed for their choice of
Yeah.
toys, which tend to be weapons. Well, we need
No.
that. That's not something you have to train a boy in. If you have raised sons and daughters, this was very
Yeah.
clear. In our home growing up, with the kids growing up, uh, you know, uh,
Oh yeah.
boys will turn anything into a weapon. They'll turn a stick into a toy gun, basically, because they have that warrior
Yeah.
instinct. They have that protective instinct. And of course, that can manifest itself in good ways or in bad ways. So, part of what you want to do with a boy is mold him so that protective instinct, that warrior instinct, that
Yeah.
instinct to take on a mission, to go to battle, that it's developed in a good way. So he's defending good things and he's fighting
Yep.
against bad things rather than the reverse. But I think one thing that Peterson has really tapped into is the way in which men have been shamed in our culture, or the ways in which men have been um, certain things
Yep.
about manhood have been pathologized. I mean, if you think about it, so many things that men are drawn to or that men like are
Yep.
now considered a huge problem. Men, tend to like things like cars. Well, now we're told,
That's
you need
right.
to do away with gas engines. Men like
That's
football.
right.
We're told football's too dangerous. Men like guns, and we've got this big push to, attack guns and gun control and outlaw guns and that kind of. So things that men are drawn to are being pathologized instead of being sanctified. Instead of finding a right way to embrace these things and a right way to live these things out. And I think this has happened in the culture at large, but I think it's bled
Hmm.
over into the church. Another example that Peterson gives, just the masculine spirit, masculine energy, masculine
Yep.
drive tends to be very competitive or ambitious. And that's also something that maybe, especially in the church, ambition is seen as a big problem. But it's interesting to me, it is clear from Scripture that there is godly and
Yep.
ungodly ambition. So Paul actually says at the beginning of 1 Timothy 3, he says, if any man has
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
ambition to be a bishop,
That's right.
he desires a good thing. So there's a kind of holy
Right.
ambition there to be a leader of men, to be a leader in the congregation. And Paul, obviously there's bad
Yeah.
ways to do that too. You can have an ungodly ambition for those
Right.
kinds of things if you just want, say, power for yourself or to make a name for yourself, something like that. But the fact
Right.
that there is godly
Well, Jesus,
ambition,
when
um,
they were arguing about who's
godly
greatest, said,
drive,
"Here's how to be greatest." He didn't say, "Shame on you for wanting to be great." He said, "Okay,
right?
first thing, you have to want to be great. You want
Exactly.
to be great? Let me show you how that works in my kingdom. I'm gonna teach you how to be great."
Yeah. Yeah. The problem is not wanting to be great.
Yep.
The problem is how you go about it and how you define greatness. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I think this has bled over into the church, where the church is hostile to certain
Hmm.
forms of masculinity, which it ought not to be hostile to. And the result is, kind of going back to where we started, it kind of makes men feel like they have to
Yep.
choose between their
Yep.
masculinity or their Christianity. So Christianity is
Yep.
mainly for women and children, and then if I'm going to be really
Yep.
masculine, that's not for me. And of course, that's entirely false. It should not be that way at all.
Yep.
The Christian faith is for everybody, obviously, and should be. But there are ways to be very faithful in
Yep.
your manhood as a Christian. In fact, ultimately, manhood and Christianity ought to be fully compatible. The
Yep.
best men ought to be Christian men. And again, we can, we need to avoid any kind of
Sure.
caricature of what masculinity is. There are certainly caricatures out there. There are ditches on both sides. But a man who, this is something that Peterson also has emphasized a great deal, a man who takes responsibility for himself
Yep.
and a man who is competent. In Peterson's work, those things often go together and really, I think, get to the heart of what manhood is all about. There's a kind of competence, which you talked about, dominion. I think that ties in with that, and then taking
Yep.
responsibility for yourself. The whole Peterson's whole message to men really boils down to just one thing, and that is take responsibility for yourself. Sometimes he puts it in the form of like fix yourself, which of course we as Christians would want to say, well, God's grace is necessary. We can't fix ourselves, just like we can't save ourselves. But by the grace of God, we can certainly improve ourselves. By the grace of God, we can become the men that God designed us to be, and we can express our masculinity in ways that are constructive, in ways that bring life, in ways that bring protection and provision to others. And that's really what God's called us to.
I would encourage people to check out the Jordan Peterson video. I think there's a lot of good stuff in it. He kind of spends the first, maybe 75% of the video really framing up what he's going to say to the churches, and I think he dives into the ideological accusations, and you just went through them: patriarchy and humanity is a cancer, the kind of ecological global warming stuff, and then kind of this war on male ambition. I do think it's really important that the church, and I think it's part of the gospel message to men, is actually to expose how they've been brainwashed. It feels probably to too many men today outside of the church that there's no point in being here. I'm white, I'm part of the problem. I'm male, I'm part of the problem. I'm a human, I'm part of the problem. What's the point, And so I think these men have been beat down, and it's depressing. It's 100% depressing.
I've heard a couple of public school teachers that I've talked to this about, and so this kind of gives you some sense of how things are out in the world, but they will talk about how you can just see it. And this is a generalization. Obviously, there are all kinds of exceptions, but you can just see that boys, and we're talking, junior high, high school age, boys just completely lacking in confidence, largely ashamed of themselves and who they are, especially if they're, white males. From a Christian background in particular, whereas the females will just be brimming with confidence, and they've told they can do anything and be anything. And it when the way one teacher put it, he said, even just walking down the halls, it's like you can see the females walk through the halls of the school with their heads held high, and the boys with their heads down, because it's like they're just kind of ashamed, and they don't feel like they fit anywhere. And I think that's something we have to reckon with. There's a mission field out there, and I think Peterson, is certainly not the first to alert us to this, but there's a mission field out there. I think the fields of young men are white unto harvest, and I think it's an area where the church definitely ought to be pursuing its mission and calling those young men to Christ, to the gospel, and to true and faithful expressions of what manhood is designed to be. I want to give you one other example of this. I know we got to wrap up here in just a minute. One other example of this is how I think the church has been hostile to masculinity, and that is, in many cases, we have let the Great Commission displace the creation mandate. So the creation mandate is Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply, rule the earth, subdue it. Obviously, that's given to men and women together. That's given to the whole human race. That's fundamental to our human existence. The Great Commission then, of course, is Jesus commissioning his church, his whole church, to go and make the nations into his disciples, baptizing them and teaching them everything he has commanded. But I think I think the way the two commissions are to relate is that really the Great Commission fits inside of the creation mandate. In a fallen world, the whole point of the creation mandate is to build a God-glorifying civilization. When man falls into sin, now he's going to build a demonic, satanic civilization. And so in order to get man's civilization building project back on track, men have to be converted. Nations have to be converted. And so the Great Commission, in a sense, the train is wrecked, it's off the track. The Great Commission puts the train back on track so it can reach its destination of this God-glorifying civilization. But if you only focus on the Great Commission to the exclusion of the creation mandate, what happens is the Christian, the whole Christian message is just about your soul going to heaven when you die. And there's not any, it gets reduced to that largely. And so the bodily life, building civilization, building a God-honoring society, involvement in politics or entrepreneurship, various forms of business, all those things kind of get marginalized in your understanding of the Christian faith
Yep.
and the Christian life. All those things we talked about related to the ambition and drive and orientation towards a mission that men have, all of that kind of gets marginalized because the only thing we're left on earth to do is to try to save other souls. And I know Peterson actually says
Yeah.
save souls. This is one area of his talk that I would correct. Christians are about building civilization. We are about saving the
Sure.
planet in that sense, not in the social justice
Yep.
way, not in the way of radical environmentalists, that kind of thing. But we're doing much more than saving souls. We are here to build a God glorifying civilization. Yep. And men are fundamentally civilization builders. Doug Wilson has said, I think it's exactly right. Wilson has said, men with mouths to feed build civilization. And that's right. Men are driven to build civilization. And if you exclude that or marginalize that in terms of how you understand the Christian faith, then it just again makes it look like the Christian faith does not have very much there's no Christian message to men. When my son was in college, he saw this with a lot of Christian men in college. He I don't know if he came up with this term or not, but he called it hobo Christianity. Okay. And the idea was, they didn't really study that hard. They didn't really have a lot of ambition or drive. They were there, most likely their parents paying for it. And for them, it was about just, going to Bible studies and trying to be evangelists on campus. And they didn't give a lot of thought to how they might fulfill their future vocation as Christians. They kind of demonized any kind of desire for wealth or for success. As those were bad or wrong in every sense. There's kind of this rejection of the material world, even like the whole idea of the Christian life is to be poor and downtrodden and kind of a doormat for Jesus is kind of the idea. It's hobo Christianity. And I mean, I think that's totally false. Obviously, Christians come from all strata of the socioeconomic spectrum. No question about that. And you don't, but the what I think was striking about it was it's kind of a poverty gospel is another way I've heard it described. Like there's something virtuous about being poor, or something virtuous about not having any ambition for any, earthly thing at all. And again, I just think that's false. That's alienating to men if the Christian faith is presented that way. Again, there's a good and righteous way to pursue success in your vocation. To pursue your mission is going to be tied very much to your vocation. That's what God wants you to do. How is your mission, your vocation, contributing to the advancement of the kingdom of God? And you can ask that question as a doctor or a lawyer or a banker or a businessman or an entrepreneur, whatever it might be. And the church needs to have a good answer to that question. But the point of you working your job during the week is not just so you can make money and then tithe to the men who are doing the real Christian work of preaching or missions in that much more narrow sense or what have you. So I think if we see the Christian faith is all about the fulfillment, not just of the Great Commission, it's about the fulfillment of the creation mandate. Now, all of a sudden, the Christian faith is as wide as human life. It's all embraced. It's about everything. And your faith connects to everything. And you're to live out your faith in everything you do. And obviously, that's hugely significant for women as well. But it's something that I think a lot of men, they don't ever get that message. And so there's just a disconnect between their Christian faith and what they feel compelled to do as men, the work they're called to do day by day.
Amen to all of that. I think I think we should wrap up. Rich, why don't we end on there was a quote in the and we both wrote it down. It kind of made an impact on both of us, but there was a quote kind of right almost towards the end of the video where Jordan Peterson is speaking really directly to the church and what their message to men ought to be. I think it'd be a great place to kind of end and summarize our conversation and what we think really is the gem and the real bright spot in Jordan Peterson's message here to the church. Will you read that quote? Do you have it?
Yeah, sure will. So this I thought was kind of the money quote. There are some problems with it, and I'll mention those in a minute. But this was really the money quote, I thought. Peterson says the Christian church is there to remind people, young men included, and perhaps even first and foremost, that they have a woman to find, a garden to walk in, a family to nurture, an ark to build, a land to conquer, a ladder to heaven to build, and the utter terrible catastrophe of life to face stalwartly in truth, devoted to love and without fear. This actually ties in really well with what I was just saying. Peterson, he wouldn't necessarily use this language, but he's taking us back to the creation
Yep.
mandate. A woman to find. Okay, well, actually, Adam was given his wife; he didn't have to find her. But
Sure.
yes, for young men, Martin Luther, said, "What does a young man needs to do? He needs to strike out and find a
Yep.
wife." That's Most men are not going to be able to accomplish their mission in life without a woman by their
Right.
side. And so find a wife. Today, you've got tons of young people in the church and outside of the church who don't want to marry. They've rejected the institution of
Yep.
marriage. And whether that's because they're addicted to pornography or they're just cynical about the institution of marriage, whatever it may be, they don't see marriage as good and necessary for the vast, vast majority of
Yep.
people. I like that Peterson says, you've got a woman to find, go find her.
Yep.
A garden to walk in, that puts us back in the Garden of Eden. Man is
Mm-hmm.
to protect and provide within that garden. He's to guard and cultivate the garden.
Mm-hmm.
A family to nurture. For a man, family is largely, for most men, is going to be what makes life worth living. It's going to be why you work the way you
Yeah.
work and do what you do. An ark to build. Lots we could do with that metaphor. The ark, of course, for the early church fathers became a symbol of the
Mm-hmm.
church. A land to conquer, that ties back, we could say, to, say Joshua and conquering the promised land. That ties into the mission of the church. It ties into the kind of spiritual warfare we've talked
Yep.
about. A ladder to heaven to build. Now, this one I think he gets wrong. We don't build the ladder to heaven. God provides the ladder to heaven
Yep.
through his son. That's salvation by
Yep.
grace versus perhaps some kind of Pelagianism that you have on Peterson's part. But still, the point is there is a ladder to heaven. Uh, and then this is interesting. The utter terrible catastrophe of life to face stalwartly in truth, devoted to love and without fear. I'm postmillennial. You're postmillennial. We believe ultimately the gospel is going to prevail. The gospel is going to win. Jesus he set out to save the world. He will accomplish that mission. But Peterson is right in the sense that life is full of suffering and
Yep.
hardship. And what do we want to tell Christian men about that?
Yep.
Face it with
Yep.
courage. Don't let the suffering of life, the hardships of life, make you
Yep.
cynical. Continue to love
Yep.
people. Continue to be courageous in the face of difficulty. James 1 even tells us to, Peterson says, face these trials, the catastrophe of life without fear. James 1 goes beyond that and tells us to face the trials of life with joy.
Yep.
And we can do that if our joy is ultimately rooted in Christ and all that he has promised to us.
Well, I love, Peterson is so down about the catastrophe of life, and he it comes up a lot in a lot of his stuff, and maybe he overemphasizes the trials and difficulties of life, but to me it's maybe it's an overcorrection, but it is a correction to how the church wants to talk about life, and only whether it's a prosperity gospel kind of thing or it's just a saccharine kind of let's cherry pick all the nice parts of the Psalms. If you read the Psalms, if you read Ecclesiastes, if you read the book of Job, you know that bad things happen to good people, and wicked men live long lives and are successful in God's economy. God allows that to happen, and it from our human perspective looks like a tragedy and is painful, and men need to be able to deal with that. And when they walk into a church
Right,
that just
right.
tells them it's all sunshine and roses, they're right to call BS on that and walk out. That's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
healthy.
that's exactly right. I think what Peterson is saying is you got to be able to look your trials squarely in the eyes.
Yeah,
You got to be able to look at your trials squarely and then say, I'm not going to let this knock me off
right.
course.
That's right.
And you be faithful through the midst of them. And recognize, as Christians, we can say all of those trials are part of God's providence.
Yeah,
They're all there to mature us, to strengthen us,
yeah,
to toughen us up,
yeah. That's right.
to grow us into the kind of people that he wants us to be.
That's right.
That's why he puts these trials in our lives. So, you know, Peterson doesn't have the divine design that stands behind all of the trials we go through. He doesn't see how, yes, there's the suffering of the cross, but ultimately there's the glory of the resurrection. I'm not sure if he thinks Jesus rose from the dead or not. I'm not sure what he would say about that. But we as Christians, we have these missing pieces that we can use to fill in what he's saying there. And yes, I think what you said, Larson, is exactly right. We as Christians should be able to face the injustices and the trials and the suffering, the catastrophe of life, and be undaunted by it, because we know that we belong to God. We know that we have great comfort in the gospel. We know what God is doing, how God is strengthening us, how God is maturing us.
Amen. Well, there's like 25 other conversations I want to launch into from here, Rich, but we'll put a pin in it, and we will pick this up on our next episode. Thanks for doing this, sir, and looking forward to kicking this podcast off. Yeah. And let's do this regularly.
This was more than a minute.
What's that?
More than a minute.
Well, that's the irony of the title, I think. Got a minute. It's not going to take a minute.